Button. So it's good to have you here, and this is quite the unit that we look at and study with this intertestamental period. But before we review the session from last time, let's turn to page 28 in your question books, and we'll join in the prayer together. Almighty and eternal God, empower us mere mortals always to remember that you are the maker and owner of all things and the Lord of history. We thank you for revealing to us your will, love, and plan for all people of all nations. Teach us through the big story that unfolds in your written word what it means to live the wise and blessed life. Inspire us at all times to ponder how Jesus walked and served and embraced his way as our way. Although human kingdoms come and go and rise and fall, grant us joy as we walk through life in Jesus' upside down, back to front kingdom. Grant us peace in knowing that we are citizens of an eternal realm, and that when we bid farewell to this world, we shall live forever in your eternal presence. We ask all this in the name of him who lived, died, and rose again, so that we might have peace of heart, joy in life, and sure hope in death. Amen. So as we get ready to look at the intertestamental period, we'll review what we looked at last time with the wisdom literature. So if someone could read 36A on the top of page 80.
Three classes of religious leaders existed in ancient Israel: priest, prophet, and wise man. Each spoke with the authority of God and had his own particular gift. The wise man studied life's meaning, and from his years of experience and the accumulated wisdom of the past gave counsel. This counsel was put into written form and is known as the wisdom literature. Wisdom is not merely human insight, but the divine purpose that directs the universe. Humanity's goal is to discover that divine purpose and live in harmony with it. The wise man's special gift enabled Sorry, my eyes are bad. The wise man's special gift enabled him to interpret the meaning of life in the light of the law and the prophets. He sought to deal with issues and questions such as the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked, the relationship between obedience and prosperity. Can we mere humans really understand the nature of true wisdom? Why do the righteous suffer?
Yeah, big question. So that little sentence in the middle about humanity's goal is to discover that divine purpose with pertains to wisdom and live in harmony with it. And so we saw here that wisdom, and here it's the scroll to catch the idea of the wisdom literature and how it spoke of obedience versus disobedience, or the way of the righteous, the way of the wicked, sort of the old-fashioned signposts, obedience and material prosperity, and how those things related to one another. And of course, the ideas of wisdom and suffering and death and these sorts of things, we'll look at those some as well. This is really a picture ahead that we'll get to, but somebody take 36B.
1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 to 34 states that Solomon prayed to God for wisdom, and God granted his request. Although 1 Kings 10 focuses on the material splendor of Solomon's Jerusalem and the wisdom he manifested during his reign, 1 Kings 11 suggests that Solomon was not as wise as some thought. He built altars for the worship of pagan gods, and he himself worshiped these gods and even endorsed the practice of child sacrifice.
Yeah, so again, we get that. One of the things the Bible paints very often a very clear and honest picture of people. So Solomon wisdom, yes, but also folly and problems. So 36C.
The memory of their time in Egypt played an important role in the minds of the Israelites. The Egyptians had wisdom writings known as the Sabayet and the instructions of Amenhotep. Although wisdom literature existed also in Mesopotamia, it focused on magic and cultic practices. However, the counsels of wisdom are similar in content and tone to Proverbs.
So interestingly enough, were we to dig more deeply into the broader context that the people lived in, there's wisdom schools, that's the word they often use, in other ancient places around Israel's neighbors, and these are referencing some of those things. 36D.
The book of Proverbs is a collection of collections of teaching materials designed for use by the professional teachers in the instruction of youth. Proverbs focuses on issues such as a person's relationship with God, the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked, the wonders of wisdom, the need to work productively and avoid laziness and family life.
Okay, so broad scope. 36E, that's this picture here.
The writer of Ecclesiastes questioned the validity of some of the views of Israel's sages. He rejected the traditional view concerning the two ways and their respective consequences, maintaining that it did not adequately explain the realities of everyday life. He was pessimistic about humanity's ability to find answers to life's ultimate questions and suggested that all is vanity and a chasing after wind.
Okay, so it's a different voice in Ecclesiastes. And again, love the fact that the scriptures will have some of these counter voices that speak. Next one.
Scholars debate how to classify and interpret the Song of Solomon. It is unlikely that Solomon wrote it. Some interpret it spiritually, with God as the lover and Israel as the beloved. Some see it as poetry depicting the moods and expressions of lovers courting each other.
All right, 36G, we got a picture for that. Sherry, take that.
The writer of Job raised his voice in protest against the Deuteronomic view that righteousness is sure one of happiness and well-being. He probed the reasons humanity seeks to be obedient and insisted that the presence of suffering in a person's life was not necessarily an indication of past unrighteousness. God was under no obligation to lavish material blessings on the righteous and could, if he so desired, permit them to suffer for reasons known only to himself.
Okay. Then I'll read 36H. The concept of wisdom developed until wisdom was envisioned as an entity in itself and personified. Wisdom was the first thing God created, and after coming into existence, served God as an advisor in the initial and continuing creative process. Eventually, wisdom was equated with the law and seen as the means God provided to bridge the gulf between himself and humanity. The New Testament equates wisdom with Jesus the Messiah and speaks of Jesus as both the creator and the divine pattern that creation and humanity must reflect if cosmic harmony is to prevail. So this little one, I just put a star by it as a reminder to me, is part of the reason we dig and have been digging in this journey. We're coming towards the end, right? We're in unit 37. Next, we'll have 38, 39, 40, and then we're diving into the New Testament. And so this last little paragraph is a reminder of why we're trying to understand these things more, because they will help us when we get to the New Testament to understand the broad context there. And today's lesson is another part of that journey. So open up in your books to pages 82 and following. And then you may want to open up to the table of contents in your Bibles to see if you have something in them that are called the apocryphal or deuterocanonical books. We'll actually get to those books a little bit. We got one more lesson before we kind of dive into these in particular, but there's a real good possibility that your Bibles just contain what are referred to as the Old Testament and the New Testament. But there are writings in between those. Some of those writings are incorporated into the Old Testaments of Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christians, but not always the same. And again, we'll go into detail. I think it's lesson 39 with that. And then there are some that are not a part of either of those, and we'll dig into those writings a little bit as well. But this is why most Bibles don't have it. I've got one here on the spine. It usually says something about with the Apocrypha. And so just so you're aware that some of what we're going to be learning about today comes out of some of those writings. There are, depending on how you count them, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are up to 18 deuterocanonical books. Sometimes they're clumped together. And again, we'll go into more detail. But in between the Old Testament and the New, there are writings, some of which are incorporated into the Roman Catholic and Orthodox Old Testaments. We'll talk more about that. None of them are part of the Hebrew Bible, but they would be familiar to many of the Jewish people. So you can see what we're looking at today is about 534 years worth of history. And the Bible touches on a little bit of that, but we're going to pick it up and spend most of the time in our book because you don't have this material in your Bible. So this would be the Hebrew order for the Bible. So First and Second Chronicles would be the final book in the Hebrew Bible. Ezra, Nehemiah tells about stuff that happens after you get to what the end of First and Second Chronicles is, but it's this post-exilic time after they come back. Okay, and we'll begin then with just a quick look at our timeline. So in the timeline, again, it's this central portion here. We've looked at all of these things. We were back with Genesis 1 through 11. We spent time in the patriarchal period, the sojourn in Egypt, how they came out through the Exodus, and the time of the judges. Then eventually they got their kings and the kingdom split. And then we spent time looking at the prophets. The northern kingdom came to an end. The southern kingdom went into exile in Babylon. And then we kind of picked up this Ezra, Nehemiah information, but again, uncertain exactly where that all took place. And so you see question marks down here with Ezra and even question marks with Nehemiah. Becomes difficult to do it. But then we saw, and up here, we're going to pick up on this a little bit today. Here are the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Greeks, etc. And so we'll be working our way into kind of this period of time here, and some of these things that are numbered here as well. So just be aware that's what we're coming after. And so this chart is a part of the journey. And we'll just look at the top part for now. So when the people go into exile, they're exiled because of Nebuchadnezzar. That one long Bible name that most of the time we aren't afraid to pronounce because we've been hearing it since we were 5 or 6 years old. But we also spent a little bit of time hearing about how the Persian Empire eventually replaced the Babylonians and conquered quite a large swath of that ancient Near East area. And Cyrus the Persian is the one who was called the Lord's Messiah. He's the one who, in around 538 or so BC, said that the Israelites could return home. And he was the one then who gave them, and we picked up how Sheshbazzar and others, a group came with him, and they set up an altar, and then they began to rebuild the temple. Joshua and Zerubbabel were both religious for Joshua. Zerubbabel, likely a descendant of David, but not, and Sheshbazzar too, but no king title. This is a Persian province. They start building the temple, they stop, then they get encouraged and they build it again. And then finally in 515 BC, the temple is dedicated. Sometime after the dedication of the temple, Nehemiah makes a couple of journeys. Ezra makes journey there. And so we read some of that material, right? Good with me so far? So we don't always hear about these different kings. We don't really hear anything about Cambyses, but Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes. And part of the challenge is you've got 2 Xerxes and 3 Artaxerxes. And when it says that Ezra returned in the time of Artaxerxes, it doesn't tell us which Artaxerxes. And so it becomes, a little bit of a scholarly guessing game. But this is the Persian Empire. So from about 538 BC until about 331 BC, so roughly 200 years, the Persians are the dominant power in the region, and the returned exiles who live in and around Jerusalem are living in a Persian province. Okay? So the Persians allowed people to go back to their native countries and not to be free and independent, but to be a province or territory underneath their rule, which means they would be sending taxes and, trying to support the emperor and the empire. So clear on that? Even though you don't know all the names, that the sense of what we're looking at here? Yes? Yes. So what happens next? Well, the Greeks now come to power, and under someone we'd be familiar with, who would be Alexander the Great. And so the Greeks will eventually defeat the Persians, and much of that territory then comes under Greek control. And the Greeks will be in control from about 323 or so, probably 333 BC till about 163 BC. So for about 170 years, that region is under the authority of the Greeks. And you can see the names, right? Alexander dies in 323. And when he dies, the territory that he conquered, 4 of his generals, with some infighting there, eventually take control. So what was under the one rule of Alexander will be under the rule of 4 of Alexander's generals and their descendants. With me so far? Okay. 2 of those generals are ones we're particularly interested in because it's them or their successors that will be the dominant power and force in and around Jerusalem and its surrounding area. I'm trying to think of a modern example that comes to mind, but without getting too dated, you may be aware that at one point in time, Ukraine was underneath the rule of the Russians. And eventually Ukraine became an independent country, but we're in the midst of a rather extensive time in which some in Russia say, no, that's still ours. And they're fighting over the territory and desire to reclaim it. And so this story gets repeated over and over and over and over in human history, and it almost doesn't matter where. but just so you have that sense. So one of Alexander's generals was named Ptolemy, and so that's the PT name here. And the general Ptolemy gained control of the Egyptian part of the empire. Another one of his generals was Seleucus, and Seleucus gained control of the eastern part of the empire, Syria, and kind of going east. And so this is what is being talked about a little bit under page 83 and moving on into page 84. And eventually the Romans will come, but we'll get to there. But I want you to look at point 3 under the Greek Empire on page 83. Somebody read that, please.
The Jews absorbed little Persian thought or culture. They believed that they themselves possessed all religious truths in the Torah. However, things changed when the spirit of Greek Hellenism began to make its presence felt. Hellenism spoke at length about wisdom and encouraged people to seek it like a priceless treasure. Other Hellenistic elements had to do with religion and worship, dress, games, architecture, and language. Those who assumed control after Alexander's death made earnest efforts to introduce Hellenism into all corners of the ancient Near East, and including Judah.
Okay. That paragraph is pretty important, so you might want to circle or star it, because this is why we're spending time with that. When the Israelites, or where you want to refer to them, the Jews, were a Persian province, the Persians were perfectly willing to allow the Israelites to worship as they chose to worship. And there was no need to assimilate them. But when the Greeks gained control of the territory, they began this assimilation process of all their conquered peoples. And the word that gets used, or the term that gets used, is to Hellenize. And in case you didn't know this, Hellas, Hellas. That's how the Greeks name their country. We call it Greece, but it's Hellas, and hence from Hellas comes Hellenism. Just like maybe you know, Germans don't call their country Germany, right? They call it Deutschland. So these are just terms that are helpful to become familiar. And so one of the things that was particularly similar is that Greeks want to pursue wisdom. And we just spent a chapter looking at how within Israel, there was this hunger for wisdom, and wisdom began to be personified. And so the Hellenizing process was not necessarily replacing other views, but the fancy term they use is syncretizing them. So you might know who's the highest Greek god? Zeus, right? And you remember Zeus's wife's name? Hera, right? Right? But anyway, so Zeus. And so the idea was that they understand Zeus to be the supreme god. And so, well, you call your Zeus the Lord, that's okay. But we call him Zeus. And so there's this sense that there's these connecting points, and some within, as we'll see, some within the Jewish people welcomed and accepted those viewpoints, and others resisted them extremely. And so this is kind of where we're moving here. Okay, so looking here on this side, notice that from this picture from Ezra, from about 404-ish BC until we get down here to 168 AD, there's a good 200 and let's see, 240 years of not really sure what is happening. Because underneath the Persians, they pretty much were able to keep living as they were living before, and there wasn't much interaction. And for a long time under the Greeks, the Hellenization process pressure was there, but it wasn't until we get to this guy named Antiochus IV Epiphanes that it's big time stuff. Okay? I'm looking for thumbs again. So, when Alexander dies, the Ptolemies, so the Ptolemy, the general, and all his descendants are known as Ptolemies. Then there's General Seleucus, and all his descendants are known as the Seleucids. And so you can see point 1 on page 83 says that after Alexander's death, his generals fought amongst themselves to carve up his empire and to then increase the size of their respective realms. Between 320 BC and 301 BC, that roughly 20-ish year period, southern Syria and the lands down to the borders of Egypt, and which includes Israel, changed hands 5 times. So they're getting fought over, and sometimes they belong to the Ptolemies, sometimes they belong to the Seleucids. And then it says by 312, 2 of the generals had established their territories as the leading power. Ptolemy over Egypt, Seleucus over what had formerly been the Babylonian exile. Somebody read point 2.
The high priest of the hereditary house of Zadok, David's priest, presided at the temple in Jerusalem and was viewed as the leading political authority within the borders of Jewish territory. Although during the period of Ptolemaic rule, the high priest levied taxes for the Egyptian overlords, the actual collection of those taxes was delegated to local officials recruited from leading Jewish families, one of which was the house of the Tobias.
All right, and remember Tobias was one of the names that showed up in Ezra and Nehemiah, right? So there are these families jockeying for power, jockeying for influence. Aren't you glad modern society has laid that to rest? I mean, this is just a part of the human story. And so as they come back from Babylon, as they get resettled into the land, they reestablish the temple. Remember, they have no king, and their life centers around temple life, worship life, following the law, and these matters, so that now the most dominant authority for the Jewish people would be their high priest and their temple. And that will continue all the way down into Jesus' day, as we'll see. And that's part of what gets him into trouble. And so point 3, somebody read that.
As time went by, groups of Greeks and Macedonians settled in various parts of Palestine and established communities complete with Hellenistic architectural, social, political, and religious forms. Although some Jews looked on these new innovations as unfortunate but necessary evil, the more conservative among them bitterly resented these intrusions into their way of life. Others, such as the rich landowners, aristocratic merchants, and officials, welcome and embrace them.
So you're starting to have this change, right? The Greeks and Macedonians, as the empire is being conquered and settled, are picking up to move into these new places and to start things. Again, not at all probably that unsimilar to what we're aware of with people coming from Europe or other parts of the world to come and settle in the United States, right? make a better life for yourself here. And as they do that, they bring along their culture. They bring along their architecture. They bring along their politics. They bring along their religious beliefs, and they start setting up communities. And so by the time we get to the New Testament times, there are going to be Jewish towns and there are going to be Greek towns. Because this is what's happening all over that part of the world. And so point 4 talks about Seleucus, who eventually gains control of things, right? And so here the Ptolemies rule Judah for about 125 years, but then the Seleucids will take over, and they'll be ruling up until the time the Romans emerge and the Maccabees push them out. So the kind of timeline is there's a Babylonian dominance. Even before that, the Assyrians are replaced by the Babylonians. The Babylonians are replaced by the Persians. The Persians are replaced by the Greeks. And the Greek Ptolemies rule for a while. Then the Greek Seleucids rule for a while. And one of those Seleucid kings becomes so adamant about enforcing Hellenism and becomes so brutal. And many leaders are brutal. So it's not just him, but so brutal that there's an uprising. There's a revolt. And for about 100-ish years, the results of the revolt are relative freedom, but then the Romans show up and the Romans will continue to dominate the land. So by the time we open up our pages of the New Testament, there's Roman rule. But remember, again, probably from your world history class, you'll be familiar with this term Greco-Roman, right? So the Romans kind of emerge out of the Greek culture and continue it and also carry their own, which is why, again, you remember in school, you'd have the Greek gods and the Roman gods, and the highest Roman god is Zeus. And so some are the same and some are different, but there's overlap there, right? Your brain back in junior high or wherever it was, we learned about some of these things. So it's relatively quiet in this stretch once they settle in on who's going to control that Palestine area. But then the Seleucids come to power and they begin to control. And so that's what's talked about in point number 4. In point number 5, we're hearing how the Roman Empire is starting to emerge with power. And so there's some pressure coming at that point. And I'll read point number 6. So the Seleucid rulers now found themselves under threat from the Egyptians to the south and the Romans to the west, with the latter, being the Romans, seeking continually to extend their borders eastward. To complicate matters, the economic health of the realm left much to be desired. In an attempt to solve the financial problem, Seleucus IV tried to annul the financial privileges of those associated with the Jerusalem temple. And he also sent his chancellor to Jerusalem to extract funds from its citizens by force. Okay, you're thinking this is not going to be good, and you're right. And eventually, that chancellor killed the king and placed a younger son on the throne who had been kept hostage in Rome until that indemnity had been paid. And so these powers realize that they don't always have the power to conquer, but you can control by taxation or by, establishing a debt that has to be paid, or the battle will resume again. And then we're going to pick up on number 7. This new king who was released from Rome, took the name Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and you can see that Epiphanes means the divine one. He believed that Zeus was living in him, and his subjects responded by naming him not Epiphanes, but Epimanes, just changing the PH to an M, and that means the mad one or the crazy one, the out of his mind one. And he had two main goals. The first was to unify the realm by Hellenizing it, and the second was to expand it. And so we're going to be following then how under Antiochus, he will desecrate the temple, which will cause this uprising. And what's the desecration of the temple? A couple of things. They set up an altar inside the temple precincts to Zeus and offer sacrifices to Zeus. And that altar is referred to as the abomination of desolation. But furthermore, Antiochus will offer a sacrifice on the Hebrew offer of a pig. And there will become this requirement that in order to show your loyalty, you have to offer a sacrifice to Zeus, and once a year you got to eat just a little bit of pork. And you can imagine now the tension that this is going to cause. But the other side of it that probably isn't always as clear to us is these new powers bring new things. And some of the people embrace new things. Some of the religious leaders, for example, were given exemption from taxes, or they were given favored positions. And you wonder sometimes how this group would cooperate with that. But when you see that they benefit from it in terms of power, or position, or profit, or pleasure, is they benefit from that. Well, I guess you just got to roll with the times. Meanwhile, there would be others who would resist and decry it. And we'll even read a little bit about others who just said, this whole thing is gone to whatever, hell in a handbasket, and they actually go and they establish a new community and say, we're just going to do it this way instead. It's beyond hope. We're out of here. And again, throughout human history, depending on how much you know, including modern times, the same kind of things happen, right? Leaders will rise up that some people think are absolutely out of their minds, and that they are just doing nothing but exercising power and paying off their cronies and these sorts of things. And others will celebrate that, and others will resist that, and some will pick up and leave. So, with me so far? All right. Well, what begins to happen? And we'll go into more specific detail about some of these. Point number 8 says that in order to achieve this goal of expanding his realm, he had to have money. Why do you have to have money to expand your realm? Pretty simple answer, really. You got to pay your soldiers. And your soldiers don't work for free. And so to raise the needed funds, he began to sell the office of high priest to the highest bidder, because the high priest would have the most authority and power. And so about 175 BC, he deposed the current high priest was a guy named Onias III. And he sold the office to his brother, Jason, who was actually kind of all in on this Hellenizing stuff. So it could even break up families. And so Onias, we're told, and others with him, left Jerusalem, went down to Egypt, built a temple in a place called Leontopolis that was a rival temple to Jerusalem. They just decided, you know what? We're going to keep worshiping God, but we can't worship God here anymore. We're going to go and set up our own place. Well, in 172 BC, Jason was deposed, so about 3 years later, he deposed Jason so he could sell it even to a higher price to a guy by the name of Menelaus. And Menelaus was not a descendant of Zadok, who was David's priest, because up until this time, so all through those centuries, the belief was that it was the Zadok priests, the Zadokites, as they're called, they would be the legitimate priests. And so it would have to come from that family. And so when that occurred, you're starting again to create problems. And so Onias, who had already left and went down to Egypt, started raising a stink, and Menelaus arranged for his murder. And when he murdered him, this gave rise to riots and street fightings. And now Antiochus, the ruler, intervened and massacred 80,000 people. And people began, so discontent is growing. And as the discontent grows, it becomes even more difficult, so much so that the Syrians, and these would be the Seleucids, would build a fortress that was just on the opposite hill from where Jerusalem was. And so we're told that as Antiochus, this is point 10, returns, he plunders the Jerusalem temple. Why would he plunder the temple? Because the temple served, remember way back, they talked about all the storage rooms. The temple would serve not only as a place of worship, but it served as the national treasury. And the national treasury would include not only, remember, all the gold and thing that Solomon did, but it would include the money set aside for the buying of the animals that they needed to sacrifice. I mean, it was a place where treasures were stored. This is how they worked. And so it references that at the bottom and top of pages 84 and 85. And as he kept working on things, point 10 at the end says that the Romans began to say, you got to stop. So this pressure, but look at point 11. Somebody read that.
Antiochus now declared the Torah invalid. He also forbade the offering of sacrifices in the temple, practices such as circumcision, the observance of the regular feast, and the keeping of the Sabbath. These rites were looked on as political treason and disloyalty to Seleucid rule. The penalty for observing them was death. Eventually, the abomination of desolation, an altar to Olympian Zeus, was set up in the temple. Altars were also set up in other parts of the countryside, and all citizens were expected to offer sacrifices at them. The choice confronting all Jews was now clear. So notice that he took it to such an extreme that for the people even to practice their traditional faith was considered a crime against the state. And point 12 goes on to say that, believe it or not, many within Judah embraced Hellenism, supported what Antiochus was doing. History says that some of the Jewish males who had received circumcision wanted to participate in the Olympian Games, which were done in the nude. And to do so, they had the marks of circumcision reversed. So it wouldn't be obvious that they were Jews, and not all those who underwent the surgery survived. And so that's kind of there. 13, somebody read that.
The goal of Hellenism was to establish a universal culture built on education in which all separatism was eliminated. In such a culture, Zeus could be identified with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The goal was not to destroy any particular state, but to fill all states into the world of Hellenism. The goal was not necessarily to abolish Jewish religion, but to assimilate it into an all about developing Greek culture. The high priests appointed by Antiochus were prepared to cooperate with him in his plan to draw the Jews into the orbit of Hellenism.
Look, you folks just got to get with the times. How many of your times have we heard that sort of phrase, right? From people who are embracing a change that other people are resisting. And they say, you just got to get with the times, right? And so this is a similar sort of thing that would be playing out. And so what begins to occur while some welcome it and embrace it, others resist it. And there's a group of people raised up called the Hasidim. And Hasidim, it means pious or faithful. And directly or indirectly, the Pharisees are descendants of the Hasidim. And remember, we always, right, because of a partial misunderstanding of New Testament, Pharisee is always like the bad guys, right? Well, that's not the case. They're the ones who are saying what Antiochus is doing is wrong. They're totally devoted. So even when they say you have to stop doing these things that are distinctives, they were ready to keep doing it. And others were willing to take up arms and fight. And so here is the point, 15, that the signal for battle came from a man of priestly background whose name was Mattathias. And his grandfather was a Hasmoneus, and so that's where the Hasmoneans come from, the great-grandfather. And so he lived in a village called Modin, northwest of Jerusalem, and a Greek official came to Modin to demand that the people take part in the pagan sacrifice. He wouldn't do it, and he killed him, killed that official, and killed a fellow community member who did take part in the sacrifice as a sign to say we are not supposed to do it. And then he raced off to the wilderness. And this began a rebellion and an ongoing struggle. And it mentions the last part of 15. The wars that followed reflected the long-standing tension between the conservative Jews living in the countryside and those who lived in the cosmopolitan regions of like Hellenized Jerusalem. And again, without diving too far down a rabbit hole, you might be aware that in our country, there's often significant voter sentiment differences between people who live in the country and smaller towns and those who live in big cities. I mean, so this is just a common human reality. And so at first, these rebels just wanted to wipe out all these foreign altars, kill the people who succumbed to that belief, and circumcise children who had never been circumcised because their parents were trying to not get in trouble with the authorities. And the Syrians, the Seleucids, would attack them and initially started attacking on the Sabbath because they said, these people aren't going to fight on the Sabbath. And when about 1,000 people were massacred because they wouldn't resist on the Sabbath day, then Mattathias gave the green light for them to fight even on the Sabbath, that for the sake of the cause that we are embracing, the commandment to not fight on the Sabbath could be set aside if you needed to protect yourself or involved in the attacks. And initially, the Hasidim supported what was happening here because they also wanted to be faithful to keeping the law, but eventually they withdrew their support. But Mattathias was killed, and his third son, Judas, who got nicknamed Maccabeus, which means hammer, took up the leadership role. And that's where the word Maccabee comes from. Okay? That's a simple summary. We're going to go deeper. But go back to this chart. So Antiochus desecrates the temple. Eventually, Judas and his followers will reclaim the temple and clean it up and rededicate it. We'll talk more about that in detail. But when Judas dies, his brother Jonathan takes over for a while. When Jonathan dies, his brother Simon takes over for a while. And then we're going to follow all these different people who come to rule until we get to a guy named Herod the Great. And then suddenly we enter into a period of history that we're much more familiar with. But we're going to catch some of the background there. And what's interesting then, if you look at the transition in 63 BC, the Roman Empire Pompey conquers Jerusalem. And when that starts to happen, now the Romans are the dominant force. So really kind of up until this point, the temple is desecrated. They're appointing different people to be high priest, and we'll look at some of those things. But that's what this chart is trying to pick up. So now stand, do 4 jumping jacks, get the blood going in your bodies once again, and we'll dig into another chart. We're going to look particularly at the Hasmoneans. And the order you see on page 87 is what we get to. So I'll just make it big again. So it starts with the father, Mattathias. And Mattathias is the priest who finally says, enough. And he kills the Syrian authority and a fellow community member who knuckled under, and they start this rebellion. So Mattathias, number 1, he's Mattathias Hasmoneus. He's a Jewish priest. He began the revolt against Antiochus IV Epiphanes. When he dies, his son Judas takes over. So there's 5 sons, and the next chart will actually put them in birth order, but they're put here simply in order when they rule. So Judas, his son, rules. He's killed in battle in 160 BC. So Jonathan, his brother, takes over, but he gets assassinated in 142 BC. And that's when Simon, the third brother, and then the third son, takes over, and he takes control until he dies in 134 BC. And he has 3 sons, Mattathias, Judas, and John Hyrcanus. His son John, who picks up the name Hyrcanus, rules for the next 30 years. Hyrcanus has children, Aristobulus, Antigonus, and Alexander Jannaeus. And so when he dies, Aristobulus I rules for a year and actually imprisons his other 2 brothers because he wants control. And his wife, Alexandra Salome, but she's also known as Salome Alexandra. So the order for her names are different because Salome is the Hebrew part of her name. Alexandra would be the Greek part of her name. And so even in the text, you will sometimes have Alexandra Salome, or you'll have Salome Alexandra. If you Google it, which is the only reason I know this, because I Googled it, right? So it's got to be true because I saw it on Google. Right? But when I Googled it, I found it under both ways. So that's part of what's doing. So anyway, when Aristobulus dies, Alexandra releases the 2 brothers from prison, marries Alexander Jannaeus, so he takes over and rules, and then eventually when he dies, she rules for a while. So she's a queen for a bit. Okay? We'll slide up here, and we're still under. So their children from Alexander Jannaeus, they have an Aristobulus and a Hyrcanus. And so after she's done ruling, one of her sons, Aristobulus II, will rule. Then his brother will rule. So you're kind of following this family tree here. Then when the Romans come in and see 63, so these guys are battling it out, and the Romans eventually go with Hyrcanus. And so he gets the throne for a while. But then when he dies, one of his brothers, one of his nephews, right, takes the throne. And then what's kind of interesting is he has a daughter named Alexandra who marries his nephew Antigonus. And anyway, so you keep working your way down these family, or is she married to Alexander? Anyway, I get confused. So don't feel bad if you do. But they will have these children called Aristobulus the third, and a daughter named Mariamne, and she's often called Mariamne the first because there's another Mariamne that shows up. But this Mariamne will get married to this new guy on the scene called Herod, better known as Herod the Great. And they in turn will have sons Alexander and Aristobulus. So that's kind of what this is showing, how we get from this Mattathias guy and what starts out as a desire for a religious reformation and cleanup, but eventually turns into constant political grabbing for power and wanting to dominate and be in control. Again, not probably unfamiliar or an unusual theme if you know anything about human history. I forget who it was, but you probably know the phrase that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? I forget who off the top of my head who did this. So anyway, this is the thing that's coming down the road. This is the environment into which Jesus walks. Yes. And so again, it's we don't get this stuff in Sunday school because it's pretty messy. But as you're going to see, it becomes pretty critical to at least have a framework understanding of it. So this is the kind of family tree that's on page 86 and 87. The last illustration is going to go into even more detail. And so if you get confused, it's okay, because you got this information here if you want to refer to it. But the goal is to try and have a broad understanding of the context in which the New Testament unfolds. We'll start with the land. So here is, again, whatever you want to call it, Palestine, the Holy Land, Israel. This is where the people come. And there's things in here that we haven't seen much before, but do you see these little, so here out here, Machaerus and Masada and Hyrcania and Doc, and even in Jerusalem and Mount Gerizim and Mount, you see these little like big fat letter E's laying on their backs. That's the symbol for a fortress. And so these are all fortress or garrisons are going to be built in all of these places. This down here, this is most likely, notice it's way on the other side of the Dead Sea. This is most likely where John the Baptist was beheaded, for example, later on. But
Portion called beyond the Jordan.
well, beyond the Jordan, yeah, because the most of the Bible story takes place in between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. So the stuff on the other side of the Jordan River is called beyond the Jordan. And John the Baptist does his ministry in a place called Bethany beyond the Jordan, but that doesn't show up here yet. Okay. You've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. That's right here at the top of the Dead Sea, if you look at the map. But we don't get a giant version of this map in this study. But what we get is this. This is after Mattathias and Judas Maccabeus kind of successfully overcome the Seleucids and begin to pass it down from brother to brother. This eventually gets named as an independent Judea. And Judea is the Greco-Roman form of Judah. And so underneath the beginnings of the Maccabees, they have a territory kind of like this, which would probably be the province, the old Persian province would be, it's about this. May or may not, I'm not sure enough, controls this area on the other side of the Jordan, but that's where it's at. So this is this independent Judea. They finally gain their independence. Well, under John Hyrcanus, they gain more territory. And so by the time you get to 104 BC, this is the area that they control. And then finally, by the time you get to Alexander Jannaeus, he expands it even more. And so that's what these three sections are. Notice what's happening then. They're starting once again to become a power to be reckoned with. And this space underneath the Maccabees is approximating what David controlled. So hang on to that too, because that whole sense of the son of David, that king in the line of David is going to play out here as well. So that's what this right-hand side of your picture is trying to show. So first they had this, they built it up to this, they eventually built it up to this. But when we read through here, you're going to understand that building it up was brutal. Building it up was exercising lots of power and authority, and very often getting rid of any opposition you could whatsoever. With me so far? So now we switch to the other side of the drawing, and we're going to look at the rulers. And so the very first ruler is this Mattathias Hasmoneus, who has this little loaf of bread looking thing is a priest's hat. And then there's a little crown on his head because he's not king, but he's the ruler. They don't even necessarily use the word prince. Sometimes they use the word ethnarch. But anyway, he's a political power and a religious power. But the religious is bigger than the political. That's the size. And this guy, Mattathias Hasmoneus, I'm going to have to move my picture for a little bit here. See if we can get this to work. Has 5 sons. And when he dies, his third son, hence the arrow from the third son, is Judas Maccabeus, who has the sword and the hammer because that's what his nickname was, and the sword because he's taking up a fight. And on page 89 to the top of page 90 is a summary of his work. Notice the language in the second paragraph. It says Judas succeeded in assembling a guerrilla group that dealt with the Syrian forces sent into Palestine to crush the revolt. And guerrilla here, that usually has a negative term, but what it means is they don't have enough soldiers to go mano a mano against the Syrians, so they do sneak attacks or things like that. Probably, if you think about it, you can remember, again, depending on the names are often indicative of who's describing the thing, but you could describe the fight of the American colonists against the British as a guerrilla group. We didn't have, in our history at that time, didn't have the manpower to fight against the British early on. And so they do these sneak attacks or things, okay? And this is kind of what's unfolding. And it mentions that while the Syrians wanted to just completely wipe out this rebellion, at the same time, they were fighting on the other end of the empire or the other end of their territory against the Parthians, which was a large enough force that he could never dispatch a demolishing force. So if they weren't fighting against the Parthians, this is the Seleucids, if they weren't fighting against the Parthians, they could have sent an army in to crush the revolt. But they didn't have that luxury because they were fighting over here. So they sent a smaller group and they could defeat them. And it's very interesting. Somebody read that second paragraph under number 2 on page 89.
Judas succeeded in assembling a guerrilla group that dealt with the Syrian forces sent into Palestine to crush the revolt. Fortunately for Judas, Antiochus was occupied in the eastern part of the realm fighting the Parthians, which limited the size of the force that could be dispatched against Judas. After repulsing a Syrian attack led by Lysias, Judas boldly determined to rid the temple of the abomination of desolation that Antiochus had placed within it. The priest Menelaus was still in control of the temple. However, in 165 BC, Judas's men captured Jerusalem, cleansed the temple of all traces of the pagan cult, and shut up the Seleucid garrison and the Jews who supported Antiochus in the Arca fortress. The cleansed temple and the altar were then rededicated and restored for proper use. The event was celebrated for 8 days and is recalled and celebrated in the annual feast of Hanukkah. Judas's victory had wiped out 3 years of blasphemy.
So remember, and Menelaus is an example of not everybody was against what Antiochus was doing. And so they were still doing all the temple stuff mixed in with the Greek stuff. That didn't bother them. And so Judas Maccabeus leads this revolt, and they eventually cleanse the temple. And that other fortress that was across from Jerusalem is where they just kind of, hold up in, the Syrians and Menelaus and others who were supportive of him. And so for a time being, then they had the temple, and the story goes that they had enough sacred oil to burn the candles for 1 day. And they didn't have time to do the consecration of the oil, but miracle of miracles, that 1 day worth of oil lasted 8 days, which is why Hanukkah is an 8-day festival. And if you ever hear about the dreidel, the little game that children's play with this kind of a little top with 4 sides on it, it has 4 Hebrew letters on it that stand for the Hebrew phrase, Reis Gadol Hayashem, a great miracle happened there. And so when they spin the dreidel, whichever thing pulls up, it's part of the game that's still there. But this idea of Hanukkah, and Hanukkah is still celebrated amongst observant Jewish people still today. So this is what they're commemorating. So even if you take nothing away from this chapter, remember that's what Hanukkah is about. Hanukkah is a rededication of the temple, a cleansing of the temple. And under Judas, that's when it happens. Okay. So the next paragraph points out that that was their major objective, but they decided to keep going. They wanted eventually to have full independence. And so they began to rescue these minority Jewish groups that were scattered throughout Judea and the Transjordan and bring them to Jerusalem. Because one of the ways that you can extend persecution is by isolating the groups from each other. Okay. Well, Antiochus happens to die. This is 165. Antiochus dies 2 years later, and his young son is put on the throne. But what ends up happening is it looks like there's going to be trouble, but reinforcements come, besiege Jerusalem. It looks hopeless, but the general who had to return home to preserve his own authority drew up a treaty and allowed the Jews to follow their own rules. And so, as it says at the bottom of page 89, although the Maccabees had now achieved their primary goal, the temptation to gain greater independence and political power remained, and their troubles were far from over. Because that general and the king were murdered. There's a new king named Demetrius, and there's now called Hellenistic Jews. Get the idea? They're the Jews who welcomed the Greek influences. They opposed Judas and reached out to the new king for support. And the king appointed their candidate for high priest. And the Hasidim, who had early supported Judas, accepted this new priest because he had legitimate descent from Zadok, but Judas did not. And so some more battles resulted, and Judas was killed. So this is king number 2, Judas Maccabeus. Well, what happens when he dies? Well, one of his brothers, the 5th son, whose name is Jonathan, takes over in the revolt. And even though Alcimus remained in office and the people had their freedom to worship, they continued to support Maccabees. And notice what happens here, that first paragraph in number 3. The Hasidim believed that since religious freedom had been restored, enough had been achieved. Their interest was religious, not political. So they were willing, they said, we got what we wanted. But others said, we can get more. And what happened is Jonathan was offered the role of high priest and ruler by another person who wanted to gain control over that area. And so now this is why he's got, again, a priest's hat and a little crown and a sword, because he's still fighting, because the dagger, he is killed and murdered. And when he dies, the 2nd son, so his older brother, Simon, will now take up the cause. And Simon is number 4 on page 90. And Simon supported Demetrius II, and so in honor of support, he named him high priest and granted him exemption from tax and named that area of Judah a free territory, an independent territory. So it's under Simon that happens. And so it mentions that Jews now date contracts and agreements from 142 BC as the first year of Simon. And you can find that in Maccabees. But again,
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Where's the smell of fire? Don't you smell it?
I don't. Anybody smell fire? I don't, but I have a sense of smell.
I smell,
It's a little. Smoky.
yeah, like something is
Hmm.
burning someplace.
I'll send a text out to our,
Yeah.
Yeah.
okay,
It's
Is
been getting a
somebody in the
little
neighborhood?
stronger.
Burning. I can go outside and see if there's.
Somebody burning leaves. Roses.
Mhm. Definitely. But, yeah. More like something inside, I don't know.
okay, maybe we'll find it.
Go out the back door.
Yeah, see what you find. So this is point number 4. And it keeps going. Right? You get this right, so not only is there struggle going on in and around Judah and Jerusalem, but you have wider struggles in this Seleucid Empire. So much so that Simon and 2 of his sons go to visit a son-in-law, and they're all murdered. So that's what these daggers and 3 people over here are indicating. But when that happened, the 3rd son who survived and was having a political position elsewhere hurried back to Jerusalem and had himself named the great priest prince. And this 5th guy is named John, and he takes the throne name and adds this Greek word Hyrcanus. And so you get the idea now that he's added a Greek name to his name. And so some of this Hellenizing stuff is working its way through. And under John Hyrcanus, or sometimes he's just called Hyrcanus, some tremendous things took place. Somebody read the top of page 91. Where it talk- yeah.
7.
Yes.
Ravaged Judah and set siege to Jerusalem. The Romans forced him to lift the siege, but in the treaty that followed, Hyrcanus was forced to pay tribute to Antiochus, and Judah became a vassal province. The independence gained under Judas and Jonathan now seemed lost.
Okay, so it looks like all of a sudden it's going to go, but keep going, read the next one as well.
A turn for the better took place after Antiochus was killed in battle in 128 BC. While his successor Demetrius II was involved in civil war, Hyrcanus conquered and regained considerable territory, destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, and captured Samaria in 107 BC. Hyrcanus had succeeded in making his realm an important military power in the region. In the style of other Hellenistic rulers, Hyrcanus minted coins upon which were embossed his name and Greek fertility symbols.
Okay, so see how it's starting to sour more. And notice that phrase that he destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, right? So you want to know why there's hatred between the Samaritans and the Jews? Well, some of it dates back to what Hyrcanus did when he destroyed their sacred temple. Furthermore, somebody pick up the next paragraph.
However, all was not well. Hyrcanus was opposed by the Pharisees, the spiritual descendants of the Hasidim. Their opposition continued until the dynasty finally fell. The Pharisees accused the Hasmoneans of profaning the office of high priest out of a desire for military and secular power.
Okay. So here's the Pharisees. Keep reading.
There was truth to the charges of the Pharisees. Although the Maccabean uprising began as a revolt against persecution and out of a desire to defend Judaism against the inroads of Hellenism, the leaders of the movement became something of a Hellenistic princely dynasty themselves. The clash between Hyrcanus and the Pharisees was inevitable.
And one more.
Although the Sadducean party, consisting of priests and nobles, should have felt unhappy about a Maccabee as high priest, they tolerated the situation and allied themselves to the Hasmoneans to gain influence in the realm.
So now do you understand a little of the tension between Pharisees and Sadducees? At least the origins of some of that. Well, when Hyrcanus dies, he is going to want his widow to succeed them, and for his son to serve as high priest, but his son Aristobulus imprisoned his mother and two of his brothers, and he allowed his mother to starve to death. And he was already the high priest, but he took the title king. And so notice now the crown gets bigger in these pictures. But he dies after ruling for only 1 year. And that's when his wife, Alexandra Salome, brings one of his brothers out of prison and marries him. And this is the brother Alexander Jannaeus. And Alexander Jannaeus also has a big crown and the priest's hat. And he is the one who will expand the territory even more, but he does so brutally. Look at what he does. He crucifies 800 Pharisees who thought they had an opportunity to rebel when Alexander Jannaeus lost the battle that also lost the army he was fighting with. He didn't die, and he had other soldiers, and so, but they thought, we got it. He's out of here. We can rebel. And when he comes back and brutally reestablishes control, he crucifies 800 Pharisees right outside his, across from his eating place where he and his harem would enjoy a meal and watch these enemies of the state die in agony. Not a good story. He will eventually die, and his wife will take over. And so now Alexandra Salome, or Salome Alexandra, both ways, she becomes queen. And she actually proves to be a mitigating leader and brings peace and order to the realm and made peace with the Pharisees. And she herself has 2 sons. And her 2 sons are Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, both the second, because there's other people that are named by that. And she makes her older son, Hyrcanus, the high priest. And she wanted him to take over for her when she died. I'm just reading. Okay. But the 2 brothers, this is point 9 at the bottom of page 91, fought for control. And Aristobulus gets the priest's hat and the larger crown. And he got help from some foreigners to regain control. And they would have done it, except the Romans now come to power. And when the Romans now come to power, they support his brother. And so at the top of page 92, it says, each claimant appealed to Pompey for a decision in his favor. And when Aristobulus refused to hand over the temple, he attacked Jerusalem. When the city fell, he killed many, entered the temple's Holy of Holies, something the Jews never forgot, restored the offering of Jewish sacrifices, imprisoned Aristobulus, and put his brother as high priest. But it's important to know that Hyrcanus had help from somebody named Antipater, who was an Idumean. And the Idumeans are Edomites, but by this time it's an I instead of an E and a U instead of an O. They had been forced under John Hyrcanus to be Jewish, but as Josephus, a historian, mentioned, that this, it kind of came out and about that Antipater supported Julius Caesar, who eventually beat Pompey and took control of the Roman Empire. And when all that happened, then Aristobulus, whoops, wrong button here. The Romans take power, and they have the brother named high priest. And so finally, let's see here. So in 49, this is point 2 on page 92. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Again, hey, I've heard some of these. Now I'm starting to connect some dots, right? Pompey, his rival, was forced to flee. At first, Hyrcanus and Antipater sided with Pompey, but after reading the writing on the wall, they threw in their lot with Caesar. Caesar eventually bestowed on Hyrcanus the title of ethnarch and confirmed him in the position of high priest. Antipater was given Roman citizenship, made procurator of Judea, governor of Judea. Antipater made 2 of his sons governor. Phasael was over Jerusalem, and a son Herod over Galilee. And Herod had such success that the Roman Senate appointed him as king of Judea in AD 40. Excuse me, BC 40. Caesar's killed in 44, and the Jews weep because they would have seen him as helping to get rid of some of the other stuff. No, he is Roman, but was getting rid of these bad Greek influences there. But and it just, I mean, this is like soap opera stuff, right? Antipater and his son Herod supported the assassins, but Hyrcanus's cupbearer killed Antipater. This put the Idumeans and the Hasmoneans in the place of getting married. And so here's where this Mariamne marries Herod. So now Herod, who's an Idumean, is linked in to the Hasmoneans because he marries into the family. And then, I mean, this story gets prettier, right?
Got it. And just saying.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Point 5. Antigonus captures Phasael and Hyrcanus and cuts off Hyrcanus's ears. And because of that, he's no longer able to be high priest. And you can look that one up in Leviticus. Phasael committed suicide. His brother Herod fled to Rome. He won the favor of Octavian and Mark Antony, names you may recognize. Again, they declare him king of Judea, but they said, we agree you're king of Judea, but you've got to conquer the territory. And that's what Herod does. 3 years later, with Roman help, Hasmonean power came to an end. Herod, an Idumean, married this daughter and ascended the throne and reigned from 37 to 4 BC. That's the end of our pictures. And the pictures may not be much tremendous help to you. but at least helps put things together. And we still have a few pages left because on page 93, 94, and 95, we're going to read about Herod. And so we're just going to read these. So we'll start here and just work our way through point by point. Go ahead, Chuck.
Herod had received a good education in the art of political survival from his father, Antipater. While serving as governor of Galilee and after putting to death a bandit leader, the Jerusalem Sanhedrin summoned him to Jerusalem to stand trial for murder. Although Herod was expecting to appear before the Sanhedrin with a humble demeanor and dressed in dark robes, he arrived dressed in lavish purple robes, accompanied by his bodyguards. Hyrcanus called off the trial and advised Herod to leave the city.
So get an idea of the kind of personality he had. Go ahead, Ken.
Herod found refuge with the Roman governor in Damascus, who put him in charge of southern Syria and gave him the governorship of Samaria, Galilee, and
Coelesyria.
Coelesyria. When the Parthians invaded Herod's territory in 40 BC and placed the Hasmonean Antigus on the throne, Herod first sought refuge in Masada, then fled to Rome to seek help, returned to Palestine, gathered an army, rescued his relatives in Masada, and finally, with Roman help, captured Jerusalem in 37 BC. Contrary to Herod's wishes, the Romans devastated the city, slaughtered many of its citizens, and executed Antiochus.
Okay, so again, that's just kind of covering what had happened where he fled to Rome, got declared king and able to come back. But the piece that's interesting is when he conquered the city, that was going to be enough for him. But the Romans had at it, and it wasn't exactly what he wanted. And that's when they murdered Antigonus. Okay, go ahead, Linda.
Many Jewish leaders had supported Antigonus. Herod had hundreds killed and seized their estates, thereby adding greatly to his own wealth. Among the victims were 45 members of the Jerusalem nobility, most of whom were members of the Sanhedrin. Herod then packed the Sanhedrin with his own followers. His advisors were Greeks. His army consisted largely of foreign mercenaries. He developed a secret police and a network of spies to report to him from every corner of his realm.
Okay. This is not quite as confusing, but it hopefully is troubling to listen to, right? Go ahead, Kathy K.
Herod became extremely wealthy. Revenues poured in from his vast estates, from high-priced loans to foreign rulers, from his own shrewd business dealings, and from high taxation. Most of this wealth flowed into a building program of gigantic proportions. He put up monuments as though he himself were the emperor. The buildings and gardens of the palace fortress, the Herodium, covered 45 acres and made it one of the largest royal buildings in the ancient world. He built 3 palaces in Jericho, one of which became his favorite home, 2 atop Masada, and others in Ascalon, Sepphoris, Jerusalem, and elsewhere. He created 2 new cities at Sebes, ancient Samaria, renamed to honor the emperor, and Caesarea, formerly Stratos Tower. Caesarea, which became the kingdom's first true seaport, was built around an artificial harbor protected by massive breakwaters. Abraham's traditional burial place at Mamre, Hebron, was enclosed with massive masonry.
So some of the ruins of these things that Herod built 2,000 years ago are still visible, including the breakwater, remnants of the breakwater in the sea, in Mediterranean Sea, for this artificial port that he created. And it's because of these building programs that he becomes known as Herod the Great. It's not because he was a great guy, as you'll get, and you may have read this already. Keep going. Somebody, Kathy C.
Herod turned Jerusalem Herod turned Jerusalem itself into a Greco-Roman city. The rebuilding project began soon after Herod took office and continued until well after his death. The work gave steady employment to thousands of craftsmen and common laborers and turned the city into an international showplace. Among Herod's Jerusalem projects were the fortress of Antonia, an enormous palace in the elite western sector of the upper city, a theater, an amphitheater, hippodrome, parks, gardens, and fountains. Finally, in 19 BC, Herod began the restoration and embellishment of the Second Temple. The central structure was soon completed, but work on its precincts was completed only about AD 63, 7 years before its final destruction by the Romans.
So lots of things going on, including even in Jerusalem. We'll hear much more about these as we go forward. Natalie.
Most of those who had achieved power and prestige under Herod belonged to the priestly families that had been absent from Judea since the Babylonian exile. Not only had these families played a leading role among communities of the diaspora, but they had also mingled with the rich and powerful of the Greek and Roman worlds and had absorbed cosmopolitan attitudes and tastes. These influential people became part of Herod's realm either because Herod encouraged them to return or because his expanding borders engulfed them. They found themselves feeling more at home among the members of Herod's court than among those who had maintained Judea's traditions for centuries. The control of the temple and priesthood passed into their hands.
Okay, that's pretty huge. So you hear he's kind of how that's changing, and this is what we're going to be running into in New Testament times. I'll read, and then we can go back to the back. In about AD or BC 23, Herod appointed the highly respected Simon ben Buthus from Alexandria to the position of high priest, and shortly afterward married his daughter, another Mariamne. Simon remained in office until 4 BC, which was the year of Herod's death, when Herod, suspecting Mariamne of plotting against him, divorced her and replaced her father. Simon's replacement soon lost his position, as did his replacement, who was followed in rapid succession by two of Simon's sons, Joezer and Eleazar. A third son, Simon, later held the position under direct Roman authority. This chaotic series of events sowed the seeds for a new elite among the high priests, their families, and their descendants. Go ahead, Sherry. Number 8.
Herod had surrounded himself with philosophers and academics as advisors. His closest advisor and confidant, Nicholas, came from the ancient but thoroughly Hellenized city of Damascus. He had received a full Greek education in the arts and sciences and embraced the philosophy of Aristotle. A scholar with an international reputation, he had been a tutor in the court of Antony and Cleopatra and transferred to Herod's employment after their deaths.
So there you go. Somebody who was working for the Roman emperor, and of course Cleopatra is the Cleopatra, right? I mean, you know her as Elizabeth Tate. No, not really. But anyway, you know, the Cleopatra and Mark. I mean, these are right. This is starting to rack into some history that you probably are familiar with. So when they were killed, this guy came and went to work for Herod. So you get the sense, even though he's a real jerk, that he's building up quite the political machine. Keep going. Chuck, we'll start with you again.
At heart, Herod was a Hellenist and displayed little interest in Judaism. He was a king of the Jews, but certainly not a Jewish king. All ranks and designations at Herod's court were Greek-inspired, including the official playmates of the royal children. Coins were inscribed in Greek rather than in Hebrew. Greek names were common among the Jewish upper class, and kingdom's chief financial minister who had charge of the king's signet ring, was named Ptolemy.
All right, so there you go. Totally Hellenized. Ken?
Herod's military forces were composed largely of mercenaries. His personal bodyguard was a company of 400 well-trained Galatians given him by Emperor Augustus. There were also regiments of local Jewish conscripts and militiamen whom Herod rewarded with grants of farmlands or settled in military colonies along his borders. At one point, he added to his army more than 500 cavalrymen from Babylonia, all crack shots with bow and arrow, installed them into their own new city in a key border province in the northeast, and made their land a tax-free zone, which in turn attracted other colonists.
Okay. Linda?
Herod's subjects hated him. To them, he was only a half-Jew. His various appointments were unacceptable to the Pharisees, who on 2 occasions refused to swear allegiance to Herod and the emperor. In Herod's Palestine, the strength of Hellenism confronted the strength of Judaism, and the confrontation was never far from explosive. The resulting animosity moved Herod to resort to violence to keep his subjects under control.
Okay, so that's important there. He is not popular. And rebellion is starting to foment. Kath?
The last years of Herod's reign were marked by domestic strife. For all his political skill, he was never able to control his family, many of whom had egos as immense as his own. Herod had at various times married a total of 10 wives, and as might be expected, the atmosphere of the court became poisoned by the competition among them, with the result that he saw fit to repudiate some of them together with their children.
Thank God big egos no longer exists among people seeking political office. Yeah, okay, keep going.
Herod's first wife, Doris, bore him a son named Antipater, named after Herod's father, Antipater II. Herod eventually divorced Doris and married Mariamne, the granddaughter of the Hasmonean high priest Hyrcanus II. But when Mariamne's mother, Alexandra, successfully conspired through Antony and Cleopatra to have Mariamne's 17-year-old brother, Aristobulus III, appointed high priest in place of Herod's appointee, Herod recognized a clear challenge to his rule, with the result that the new appointee accidentally drowned while swimming with some young nobleman at the old Hasmonean palace in Jericho. This was the first of a series of family murders and executions. The next victim was Mariamne's grandfather, Hyrcanus II, who was strangled. Shortly thereafter, Mariamne, who had denied Herod access to her bed, was put to death. Even so, Herod sent Mariamne's 2 sons, Aristobulus and Alexander, to Rome to be properly educated. After putting Mariamne the first to death, Herod married a beautiful Jewess of the same name, Mariamne, who bore him Herod Philip.
Okay, and you're gonna hear about Herod Philip a little later in the story. Natalie?
Augustus had given Herod the right to name his own successor. The chief contenders were Antipater by his first wife Doris, a native of Jerusalem, and the 2 Hasmonean brothers Alexander and Aristobulus, sons of Mariam I. The latter turned out to be arrogant and abusive, openly deriding Herod and the Idumenian side of the family. Antipater, in turn, was sly and sharp and did everything he could to poison Herod's mind against Alexander and Aristobulus, with the result that Herod's family named Antipater crown prince, and Alexander and Aristobulus second and third in line. When Herod uncovered a plot indicating that the 2 Hasmonean brothers were plotting to kill him, he had them strangled. And when news reached Herod's ears that Antipater was plotting to hasten his father's death, Herod had him imprisoned in the Hyrcanian fortress on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea.
Okay. I'll read the next one. During Herod's final and painful illness, a rumor spread that he had already died before this actually was the case. Two rabbis urged the people to tear down the golden eagle from the gate of the temple in Jerusalem, which Herod had placed there. Herod responded by ordering the rabbis to be burned alive. Fearing that his death would not be mourned, Herod commanded that notable Jews from all parts of the land come to him and had them confined in the city's hippodrome. He then gave orders that upon his death, all of them were to be killed, so that the wails of grief would be heard throughout the realm. Fortunately, however, this was not carried out. It was his second to last executive command. 5 days before his death, Herod told some of his bodyguards to kill his imprisoned son, Antipater. When Caesar Augustus was informed of Antipater's death, he reportedly remarked, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." Sherry?
According to Herod's final will, Archelaus, son of his fourth wife, Malthace of Samaria, was to reign over the bulk of his territory. The remainder of his realm was to be divided among two other surviving sons. Herod Philip, son of Herod's fifth wife, Cleopatra, was to rule the Transjordanian lands of Batanea and Trachonitis. Herod Antipas, another son of Malthace, was to rule Galilee and Perea. This arrangement was ratified by the Roman Emperor Augustus. However, Augustus withheld the title of king from Herod's successors. There was to be no danger of their claiming independence from Rome.
And so we're going to hear about all of those people when we get into the pages of the New Testament a few lessons down the road. And finally, Herod died in Jericho in 4 BC, was buried in the Herodian fortress a few miles southeast of Bethlehem. Few mourned his passing. He's remembered today mostly because of what is recorded in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. In the time of King Herod, Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. And that, my friends, concludes our history class today. Lots of details, much of which you won't remember, which is fine, but the charts and the pictures here can hopefully help tie some of it together, and these chapters are there. But this is stuff we need to know because this is the seedbed into which the New Testament will open up. When we get together next time, we will be once again visiting some of this information. And in particular, we'll be looking at the distinct possibility that the book of Daniel is all about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and not necessarily about the rulers that are otherwise named in there. But again, surprise, surprise, Bible scholars debate these things. So there are other views, but we will pick up on that next time. Can we pray together? Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen.
Is this Herod that we were talking about, the one who built that huge palace?
Yes. Yep. So thank you for your